I think hopefully, and I'm optimistic that one day we will look back at cancer and aging in the same way that we're talking about HIV today. The HIV being cured headline, we can dive into it for 2 minutes, but HIV is a retrovirus. When you get infected with HIV, it stays in your body forever. It actually ends up living inside of your immune cells. That's what makes it such an interesting, challenging virus. And it destroys those immune cells. So over time, you end up getting AIDS. And the way it enters the immune cells is through a specific protein. Some people have a genetic mutation where if there's a change in their DNA and that protein is different, HIV cannot enter their immune cells, and they are naturally immune to HIV.
CCR5.
Yeah, and so what's happened is
found apparently in white Northern Europeans.
Yeah, like Norwegians, I think.
Norwegians, exactly.
And anyway, so what's the interesting study that was done? All immune cells are made from stem cells in your bone marrow, and so all the white blood cells that we have that fight off our diseases come from our bone marrow. And when you get a blood cancer, sometimes you end up getting so severe that you have to actually wipe out all the immune cells in your body and you end up with a bone marrow transplant. So you get new bone marrow put in, new blood cells put in, and hopefully, if you can survive the therapy or survive that treatment, that new bone marrow will produce new immune cells, and your body will recover, and you will be cured of your blood cancer. So what happened is people had HIV. And when you get this bone marrow transplant, you end up, they give you radiation and chemo, and they wipe out all your blood cells, and then they give you this bone marrow transplant. So they selectively chose bone marrow stem cells that came from people that have the genetic mutation that prevents HIV. So then, when these HIV patients that got blood cancer got a bone marrow transplant with this mutation in it, they were cured of HIV. And so it's a pretty profound kind of demonstration of what we already knew, which is that this genetic mutation can prevent HIV. And there are a lot of therapies that are underway right now to actually use gene editing to induce that mutation in people's blood cells and in their bone marrow without needing to give them a whole transplant.
The first guy that did it was German, right? Or he was in Germany, I think, and he unfortunately passed away. They cured his HIV AIDS, but he unfortunately had a relapse of the leukemia that killed him. But I think all three cases of people that have been quote unquote cured have been these leukemia patients.
But I'll say two things about the future of this kind of possibility. Number one is you don't need to get a bone marrow transplant to have this mutation induced in your cells to prevent this infection from kind of occurring in your body. You can use gene editing tools to do that. And so we are now developing gene editing therapies where rather than go and get a whole bone marrow transplant to cure your HIV, we can actually edit your cells. Those edited cells will now be resistant and you will be resolved of HIV. The second thing is the way that they gave people the bone marrow transplant, the way they created those stem cells for the bone marrow transplant was from umbilical cord blood from newborns, which is very rich in stem cells. And this is a traditional way of kind of giving people stem cell-based therapies is you go and source stem cells from another body or your own body, which are called autologous stem cells. But I just want to say one thing. What's really interesting in the future is not going to be about pulling other people's stem cells into your body and finding them from, fetal blood or what have you. We now have the technology, which I've talked about multiple times on the show, called Yamanaka factors, where theoretically we can take your cells from your own body, turn them into stem cells, grow them in a lab, and use that as the therapy. That's called autologous stem cell therapy. And rather than use stem cells or trying to find them and figure them out where they are in your body and pull them out, we can actually induce stem cells from your body. And that's 15 years out is autologous induced stem cell therapy, where you actually make your own stem cells and then give yourself all sorts of therapies, not just bone marrow transplants, but you can heal lots of tissue in the body using these stem cell systems.
We don't really hear about HIV/AIDS anymore. In that article, I think it said that there's about 37 million people around the world that have HIV/AIDS. And it's incredible, actually, the amount of progress that science has made in this disease. I remember when I was growing up, it was made to be like this incredible boogeyman.
Yeah.
And it really governed a lot of social norms at the time because we were still discovering what HIV/AIDS was and, how how do you think about sexual promiscuity, from a moral and ethical perspective. I think it had a huge impact on my generation. And
absolutely,
now,
it did. It was a death sentence. They made us paranoid.
So here's what's happened. Therapies have gotten so good at suppressing the virus. If the virus is suppressed far enough, even though you're always going to be infected, if it's suppressed far enough, the WHO and the FDA have both said you can still have unprotected sex and not transmit HIV. And so even though there are plenty of people out there that might be having unprotected sex with HIV, the therapies have suppressed the viral load to the point that they're not transmitting it actively. And so that's been the big breakthrough in science over the last decade.
And then they also had these PrEP pills, right, which people could take proactively if they thought they might, find themselves. But I mean, Chamath, you and I lived in a generation where, it doesn't.
It was the end of things. Yeah.
Well, it was the end of days, and they're like, I don't know if you guys had this in school.
It was the single biggest thing that I was taught in sex ed classes to be afraid of.
Be really scared at all costs.
And then the problem that it created was in countries that had a large Catholic population, the Catholic Church was so
evil.
They were undecided on.
They were the opposite of undecided. They told people in Africa to not use condoms. When AIDS was rampant, it was the second biggest evil the Catholic Church did in modern history. Obviously, the first, we know.
I do want to give a shout out to the researchers who actually did this with this woman in New York. It's pretty freaking incredible.
What's incredible is that they did it with HIV patients who had blood cancer, and it was a really kind of thoughtfully designed experiment.
Incredibly thoughtful.
Yeah.
And it's been 4 years. So, this has been baking for a long time.
By the way, as I zoom out and hear you guys talk about what HIV was like, back in the day and the fear around it, I do think that 30, 40 years from now, given the tools we have with induced stem cells and cell-based therapies, and there are hundreds of cell-based therapies coming to market over the next few years, they're all in late-stage clinical trials, as well as gene editing. I think hopefully, and I'm optimistic that one day we will look back at cancer and aging in the same way that we're talking about HIV today, and that both of those diseases can and will be resolved with the tools that we're developing through science.